How would philosophical realism apply to adoption? Well, would it classify an adopted child as a second-class family member because they are not from a substance of the parents? Nominalism would seem more amenable to making someone a family member by simply treating them like it or by fiat. Okay, I don't know if the person who asked this question knows this, but I actually have an adopted son, Bozhidar. So if you've ever seen my documentary, Becoming Truly Human, the one on the religiously unaffiliated, or the nuns, I actually share the story of Bozhidar. So Bozhidar, he's from Bulgaria, and he's Bulgarian. Specifically, he's Roma, right? So he's a gypsy. And we adopted him when he was 7 years old, and he was horribly treated, severely neglected, on the verge of starvation when we adopted him. 7 years old, only 20 pounds, couldn't walk, couldn't talk. Lots and lots of trauma there. And candidly, there's, barring a miracle, which could happen, barring a miracle, it looks to be permanent damage. No genetic reason for it, right? He's highly delayed cognitively, but there's no genetic reason for that. It does seem to be just sort of institutional neglect, that there's permanent brain damage. And you can also tell that, like, he should be a lot taller than he is, right? His body started growing exceedingly fast when we started feeding him and caring for him properly. But, it never really caught up, to where it was supposed to be. You can tell, look at his hands and his feet. You're like, that dude should be bigger. So anyway, that's Bozhidar. I love him. I adore him. He's my son. And he knows that. Now, to this question, the fact of the matter is that, yes, is Bozhidar my biological son? No, he's not. Okay. There is a very real and substantial difference between my relationship to Bozhidar and my relationship to David. David is my son, right? My biological son. And so, whether you're talking about from a realist perspective, or you're even just talking from a biological perspective, the fact of the matter is that David is an extension of my own substance, right? And that is a very real thing, whereas Bozhidar is not. And so when we're talking about this from a realist perspective, these relations are real. From a biological perspective, they're real too. But from a realist perspective, what we're talking about here is what might be called the difference between, say, it's essential accidental properties, but what's sometimes called internal-external relations, when you move into relationships of this sort of thing. So internal relations are relations that are essential to the identity of the subject. External are accidental to it, right? So in this sense, what we see is, if we look at David, it is an essential property of David, right? It is essential to him, an internal relation, that he is my son, right? In other words, he would not be David if he were not my son. And here I'm divulging certain positions that I have in terms of my understanding of individual identity. I do not think identity is a repeatable, universal. I don't think there's such a thing as Davidness that David has that we could give to somebody else, because then you would end up with the obvious absurdity that you could have two people who are the same person because they share in a common universal. So I don't actually believe that identity is a universal, that it's a form in that way. And so I do understand his identity be wrapped up in some of those particularities, including the particularities of him being my son. So for him, it's an essential property. He would not be David without that. The same is not true of Bozhidar, right? So granting free will and contrary possibilities, and then what we would have to say is that it is entirely possible that Bozhidar could have been born to his parents, and that his parents did not choose to give him up for adoption, and he would have been raised by them, and he would have never come to know me, and he would not be my son, right? That is a very real possibility, and Bozhidar would still be Bozhidar. The same cannot be said of David. And so there is a more real, substantial tether there in terms of my relationship with David, right? Now, I think the thing here is, like, the worry is second-class citizen. Does that some way denigrate the relationship with Bozhidar or make him a second-class citizen. I would say that there's a couple of different things at play here that I'd want to address. The one is this: when we use language like second-class citizen or something like that, obviously the worry is some sort of favoritism or something like that. And admittedly, when we look at those sorts of things, if we really do believe that one child is being favored over another, they're being treated unfairly, they're being treated unjustly, they're not being properly loved or cared for, or something like that, that admittedly and rightly strikes us as repugnant, right? As in some ways undesirable, as unjust, as unfair, as not good. And yet all of those sorts of terms that I just used are moral terms, right? And so these moral terms actually do go to the higher nature. These are things that go to the point of saying like choice, right? Reason and choice. So if you recall, I think I did this in the werewolves, doppelgangers things. I went through anthropology. I talked about the higher and lower nature. And I talked about the fact that the lower nature is your animal nature that has these sort of, animal impulses and things like that. And that animal impulses are not inherently moral or immoral. Your dog can go around humping anything that moves, and that doesn't make it immoral. It's just a dog. But a man does that, right? He's immoral. Why? Because he has reason and free will, right? He has the capacity to assess whether he ought to do that or ought not to do it, and then to engage in it freely. And that's when moral properties actually attach the act. Now, why do I bring that up? Because when we're talking about things like justice and we're talking about fairness, we are actually moving into, and even when we're talking about higher orders of love, like a love that actually identifies what is the good of the person and how do I fulfill that good, right? How do I act in a way that caters to that good? Those are higher order processes. That's not what a dog has, right? So when we're talking about sort of the lower nature, you're actually talking about sort of innate sort of maternal or paternal instincts, right? These sort of animalistic relation that maybe has a protective instinct toward your child or something like that. And admittedly, anybody who has undergone adoption, you recognize that those biological processes are there in ways for your biological children that they might not be there for your adopted children. And I suspect that part of the worry is, well, that's unfair to the child, right? Because the child wants to know that you're as protective of them as you are to your biological children and things like that. But the fact of the matter is that there's nothing virtuous about having a biological impulse to actually sort of move into a protective state with your child. In fact, it can be vicious, right? So the fact of the matter is that your higher order nature, just like any other passion, has to look and put in check and adjust the sort of lower nature, even in things that we think are pure. This is something that I believe it's in The Great Divorce. There's one point where there's a conversation between a woman who has a clearly distorted love for her child. And it's talking specifically about this issue. And it talks about this sort of like, it's talking about this. It's the person who's critiquing, right? This woman is actually identifying the fact that she has disordered love, and she insists like a mother's love could never be distorted, right? And Lewis rightly points out that that's actually not true. That there's no sort of impulse or biological process or something like that that is strictly speaking pure, right? You share with tigresses the impulse to want to protect your young, something like that. And the fact of the matter is that you, as anybody who also knows as a parent who is engaged in any sort of reflective behavior, you realize that in some ways those paternal or maternal instincts can go wrong. You can, for example, show favoritism. Right. It may be that two children are in an altercation. One of them is yours, and your inclination is to like not want to, treat this other child fairly and judge in favor of your child. That's actually injustice. And so that's an example of your protective instinct actually going wrong, right? In this case. And the higher nature in that case actually should step in and redirect it. You should restrain. If it's, for me, paternal instinct, right? Restrain that paternal instinct and actually correct it, saying, you're being unjust and unfair, right? This other kid is actually in the right and your kid is in the wrong. And I know all your protective instincts want to go in favor of your kid, but like, that's not true. Now, the reason I bring that up is because I think that when we're talking about second-class citizen or something like that, when we're talking about the sort of love and fairness and care and nurturing and all those sorts of things that a child is due, adopted or biological, those things actually all derive from the higher nature. And in terms of the lower nature, part of the duty of the higher nature is to stoke those and nurture them accordingly. So I know there is, there's, for example, I don't want to go off too far on this tangent, but there is, for example, a tendency sometimes in our culture to sort of treat biological impulses or passions or something like that as if there's no place to restrain or stoke. And so, for example, in terms of sexuality between a married couple, right? There's this tendency to sort of treat things strictly as if, somebody is in the mood for something like that. But again, as Lewis points out, there are certain times when perhaps a person should, out of maternal love and care and duty, I know, dare say duty with regard to sexual things, it's crazy, actually should go ahead and stoke these sort of, the passions with regard to the partner, because this would be the right and good and loving thing to do. And so I think the point of that, the reason I bring that up in this context is to say that in terms of the higher order of nature, it's entirely in your control. It's entirely an act of will. It's part of the higher nature to decide to show your adopted child and your biological child the same degree of justice, of fairness, of care, of love, of affection, all those things. And if you find that in the lower nature, right, if the concern is to say, well, maybe your child, maybe I just have a more natural affection for my own children because I have a biological tie with them or something like that. Well, if you observe that sort of thing and you identify that as unjust, right, something that you're failing to render to your adopted child what is due, then you should do what you can in order to nurture that, right? Or if there's other sorts of feelings in there that might be sort of negative that you think shouldn't be there, to do all that is in your power in order to, correct those sorts of things. So the point of all that is to say, in terms of like the second-class citizen thing, I think most of that is in the category of action, not in ontology. I don't think pretending that somehow Bozhidar proceeds from my own, substance, even though he does anything in order to remedy or mitigate a second-class citizen status. So the second thing is this. I think there is a tendency in our own culture, and I think this is a misguided sort of compassion, to sometimes try to, in some ways, treat corruptions, abnormalities, tragedies, whatever they are, as if they are not that thing, right? As if somehow by naming them something other than a corruption, as something other than a tragedy, as calling them just different or something like that, that somehow we have done a service to remedying that wrong that's in the world. And I don't believe that's true in the least. I actually think it's a disservice. And this is why. I realize that there is a tendency with somebody like Bozhidar, who is delayed, to try to, out of kindness and compassion, to say that there's nothing wrong with him, right? To say that we wouldn't want to say that the cognitive delays that he has and things like that are a corruption. We don't want to use words like abnormal or malformed or any of these sorts of words. They seem too harsh and seem too lacking in compassion and so on and so forth. Putting aside for a moment the metaphysical side of that question of whether or not those terms are the right terms, the fact of the matter is this. Bozhidar is mentally and cognitively delayed because of the devil and wicked men. Okay? So the fact of the matter is this. Bozhidar has no genetic reason why he should be cognitively delayed right now. The reason he is cognitively delayed is because people chose to nearly starve him to death. That is a product of a fallen world. Humanity has been wounded and energized and taken under the darkness of the devil. And that sort of thing where you nearly starve a child to death is evil. And if you saw the conditions in which, Bozhidar was living when we got him, that speaks of the fallenness and the corruption and the evil of our world. If you saw the ways in which he had developed institutional tics of chewing on his tongue because he's starving to death, you would recognize that that's evil. If you saw the patches on his head from where he used to rub his head against a crib because he would just rock to try to self-stimulate because nobody would hold him, you'd recognize that's evil. And so, yes, now that Bozhidar has been brought into a family and loved and taken care of, and his body has begun to heal and things like that, we see a very different boy. Yes, that's true. But first of all, I will say this. He still has problems that are problems. They are corruptions. They are things that ought not to be. And also, for all the brightness and goodness and sweetness that is there in this boy who is, mentally delayed, the fact of the matter is that mental delay is the product of having been wounded by the devil and evil men. It is a corruption. And the fact of the matter is that if I desire Bozhidar's good, I should want him to be able to grow into a fully formed, healthy man. And that is something that this side of the resurrection, barring a miracle, I don't anticipate happening for Bozhidar. Now, can beauty and goodness come from that? Of course it can, right? The very fact that our family has been able to take him in and love him has drawn a great good out of this. I've seen the way in which people have been deeply affected by Bozhidar and his story and the way he carries himself. So much good has come out of that. And yes, God excels in drawing good out of evil. But to in some ways say that what Bozhidar endured and what was inflicted upon him was not evil is to insult Bozhidar and what he went through. And so this is where the fact of the matter is, metaphysically speaking, the right words are abnormality, malformed, corruption. That is what happened, right? Bozhidar, properly formed, should be taller than he is. He should be able to speak and to reason and to grow in, cognitive, understanding, learning, make choices, get married, do all sorts of things that he, probably will not be able to do this side of the resurrection. And there is something tragic. Are there beauties and goods that come out of that? Yes. But to try to whitewash those and say, well, it's just different, is to actually, it's not only delusional and divergent from the reality of the matter. It's not just different, it's a corruption. But it's also an insult to what he's been through. And so the fact of the matter is, it is an evil. And those are very real evils that were inflicted upon him. Whatever great good has come out of it, it is an insult to what he's been through in order to just say it's different. Right. And so that's the tendency, I think. I think that sort of thing has to be acknowledged. Now, why do I bring that up? Because there is another tragedy or an evil within the story, which is that Bozhidar was abandoned by his parents. So yes, it is a great good that Bozhidar is being loved and cared for. And all of the, the compassion and the love and the redemption and things like that come out of that story are wonderful, right? Those are goods that God draws out of an evil. But the fact of the matter is that we don't want to whitewash the fact, and we ought not to whitewash the fact, that it is a tragedy that Bozhidar's parents gave him up. It is a tragedy that the people who have a duty to raise him because he is, of their own substance, because he is their son, abandoned him to an orphanage. And that, our family had to step in and rescue him. Now, happy to do it. Glad we did do it. He's a joy. I can't imagine my life without him. But none of that changes the fact that the abandonment of Bozhidar by his parents is a real tragedy. So all that's to say is I think that's an unfortunate tendency in our culture. I don't think it is a service to anyone to go ahead and try to rename tragedies as something other than tragedies, or abnormalities and corruptions as something like is just different. I think that's a disservice to, it's not only, a disservice to reality, but it's also a disservice to to the people who have suffered those things, that those are real, genuine corruptions and evils in our world. And that should be acknowledged, even if we're going to acknowledge the sort of complex goods that emerge out of those types of situations. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow, subscribe, hit like if that's an option on whatever you're listening to. All that sort of stuff really helps us out here. So I greatly appreciate your support. And until next time, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.